Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How we doing? Spectre here with another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard. Tonight, we are going to continue reading through Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. We'll pick up where we left off there, pick up on chapter 10. So, that being said, we'll see you back here on the other side. As the saying goes, get woke, go broke. We, the people, recently learned that 200 woke corporations, part of the Civic Alliance, and 90 CEOs in a Zoom call, went on record to oppose election integrity laws in Georgia. These corporations think they know what's best for we, the people. These corporations think they wield more power than we, the people. These corporations openly flaunt and thwart the will of we, the people. These corporations hide behind legal terms like personhood, thereby giving said corporations, dead entities, rights like we, the people. These corporations virtue signal at every opportunity what values we, the people, should embody. We, the people, have forgotten how to play the game, and it's time we, the people, step into the light of the Great Awakening. We, the people, have more power than they know. We, the people, have the ability to vote with our dollars. We, the people, have had enough of the fraud and are collectively throwing up the window and yelling, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore." We, the people, keep our tongues from evil and our lips from speaking lies, while these corporations have given their mouth to evil and their tongues frame deceit. We, the people, will have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of these corporations. Rather, we, the people, admonish them. We, the people, having souls, know our rights are inherent and come by the hand of God, whereas these corporations are soulless and rely upon man for their privileges, masquerading as rights. We, the people, will continue to witness the destruction of the old guard, and we, the people, will build around, through, and without these corporations. So help us God. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Appreciate you tuning in here tonight, wherever you may be tuning in. We are up on the YouTube side, we are up on Twitch, over on D-Live, and of course we've got our friends over on the Tiger Network. Thank you for joining. And of course, don't forget live over on Trovo, as well as Vaughn, in case something should happen. Make sure you get signed up over there. Be sure to like, share, subscribe all the way around. Get that out to your friends, your neighbors, your dog, whoever may be interested in hearing the broadcast. So, that being said, like I alluded to earlier, we're going to continue reading in none other than The Virtue of Selfishness. The 50th anniversary edition is what I'm pulling from November 1st, 1964. You can pick that up at Amazon. I'm just showing that here for reference. You can pick it up wherever you opt to find your books and so forth. But tonight we're going to pick up where we left off. So far, the first 3 installments have gotten us through, I believe Chapter 9, The Cult of Moral Grayness is where we left off last. So tonight we're going to pick up on Chapter 10 with collectivized ethics, and we'll see how far we get. We might get through 3 or 4 here. The monument builders, man's rights, collectivized rights, etc. And then we'll see if I need to break that last little bit up or if I'll just power through in the last installment here. But nonetheless, we'll give it a go. So here we go, Chapter 10, Collectivized Ethics. This is an essay as part of this book by Ayn Rand. It says, certain questions which one frequently hears are not philosophical queries, but psychological confessions. This is partly true in the field of ethics. It is especially in discussions of ethics that one must check one's premises, or remember them, and more, one must learn to check the premises of one's adversaries. For instance, objectivists will often hear a question such as, what will be done about the poor or the handicapped in a free society? The altruist collectivist premise implicit in that question is that men are their brother's keepers, and that the misfortune of some is a mortgage on others. The questioner is ignoring or evading the basic premise of objectivist ethics and is attempting to switch the discussion onto his own collectivist base. Observe that he does not ask, should anything be done, but what will be done, as if the collectivist premise had been tacitly accepted and that all that remains is a discussion of the means to implement it. Once, when Barbara Brandon was asked by a student what will happen to the poor in the what will happen in the objectivist society, she answered, if you want to help them, you will not be stopped. This is the essence of the whole issue and a perfect example of how one refuses to accept an adversary's premises as the basis of discussion. Only individual men have the right to decide when or whether they wish to help others. Society, as an organized political system, has no rights in the matter at all. Think of that real quick. I'm going to pause at that last statement because think of what our adversaries on the left always do. We have to steal from the rich in order to pay for the calamities of the poor because that is the just thing to do. Well, who made them the arbiter at the end of the day? Shouldn't we decide if we wish to be charitable, not at the hands of a threat of a gun and force by the government? Just a thought. On the question of when and under what conditions it is morally proper for an individual to help others, I refer you to Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. What concerns us here is the collectivist premise of regarding this issue as political, as the problem or duty of society as a whole. Since nature does not guarantee automatic security, success, and survival to any human being, it is only the dictatorial presumptuousness and the moral cannibalism of the altruist collectivist code that permits a man to suppose, or idly to daydream, that he can somehow guarantee such security to some men at the expense of others. If a man speculates on what society should do for the poor, he accepts thereby the collectivist premise that men's lives belong to society, and that he, as a member of society, has a right to dispose of them, to set their goals, or to plan the distribution of their efforts. Very, very interesting. This is the psychological confession implied in such questions and in many issues of the same kind. At best, it reveals a man's psycho-epistemological chaos. It reveals a fallacy which may be termed the fallacy of the frozen abstraction, and which consists of substituting someone particular concrete for the wider abstract class to which it belongs. In this case, substituting a specific ethics, altruism, for the wider abstraction of ethics. Thus, a man may reject the theory of altruism and assert that he has accepted a rational code, but, failing to integrate his ideas, he continues unthinkingly to approach ethical questions in terms established by altruism. More often, however, That psychological confession reveals a deeper evil. It reveals the enormity of the extent to which altruism erodes men's capacity to grasp the concept of rights or the value of an individual life. It reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being has been wiped out. Humility and presumptuousness are always two sides of the same premise, and always share the task of filling the space vacated by self-esteem in a collectivized mentality. The man who is willing to serve as a means to the ends of others will necessarily regard others as the means to his ends. The more neurotic he is, or the more conscientious in the practice of altruism, and these two aspects of his psychology will act reciprocally to reinforce each other, the more he will tend to devise schemes for the good of mankind, or of society, or of the public, or of future generations, or of anything except actual human beings. Hence, the appalling recklessness with which men propose, discuss, and accept humanitarian projects, which are to be imposed by political means, that is, by force, on an unlimited number of human beings. If, according to collectivist caricatures, the greedy rich indulged in profligate material luxury on the premise of price no object, then the social progress brought by today's collectivized mentalities consists of indulging in altruistic political planning on the premise of human lives no object. The hallmark of such mentalities is the advocacy of some grand-scale public goal, without regard to context, costs, or means. Out of context, such a goal can usually be shown to be desirable. It has to be public, because the costs are not to be earned, but to be expropriated, and a dense patch of venomous fog has to shroud the issue of means, because the means are to be human lives. Medicare is an example of such a project. Isn't it desirable that the aged should have medical care in times of illness? Its advocates clamor. Considered out of context, the answer would be yes, it is desirable. Who would have a reason to say no? And it is at this point that the mental processes of a collectivized brain are cut off. The rest is fog. Only the desire remains in his sight. It's the good, isn't it? It's not for myself. It's for others. It's for the public. For a helpless, ailing public. The fog hides such facts as the enslavement and, therefore, the destruction of medical science, the regimentation and disintegration of all medical practice, and the sacrifice of the professional integrity, the freedom, the careers, the ambitions, the achievements, the happiness, the lives of the very men who are to provide that desirable goal, the doctors. After centuries of civilization, most men, with the exception of criminals, have learned that the above mental attitude is neither practical nor moral in their private lives, and may not be applied to the achievement of their private goals. There would be no controversy about the moral character of some young hoodlum who declared, "Isn't it desirable to have a yacht, to live in a penthouse and to drink champagne?" and stubbornly refused to consider the fact that he had robbed a bank and killed 2 guards to achieve that desirable goal. There is no moral difference between these two examples. The number of beneficiaries does not change the nature of the action. It merely increases the number of victims. In fact, the private hoodlum has a slight edge of moral superiority. He has no power to devastate an entire nation, and his victims are not legally disarmed. It is men's views of their public or political existence that the collectivized ethics of altruism has protected from the march of civilization and has preserved as a reservoir, a wildlife sanctuary, ruled by the Moors of prehistorical savagery. If men have grasped some faint glimmer of respect for individual rights in their private dealings with one another, that glimmer vanishes when they turn to public issues, And what leaps into the political arena is a caveman who can't conceive of any reason why the tribe may not bash in the skull of any individual if it so desires. The distinguishing characteristic of such tribal mentality is the axiomatic, the almost instinctive view of human life as the fodder, fuel, or means of any public project. The examples of such projects are innumerable. Isn't it desirable to clean up the slums, dropping the context of what happens to those in the next income bracket? Isn't it desirable to have beautiful planned cities, all of one harmonious style, dropping the context of whose choice of style is to be forced on the home builders? Isn't it desirable to have an educated public, dropping the context of who will do the educating, what will be taught, and what will happen to dissenters? Isn't it desirable to liberate the artists, the writers, the composers from the burden of financial problems and leave them free to create, dropping the context of such questions as which artists, writers, and composers, chosen by whom, and at whose expense? At the expense of the artists, writers, and composers who have no political pull, and whose miserably precarious incomes will be taxed to liberate the privileged elite? Isn't science desirable? Isn't it desirable for man to conquer space? And here we come to the essence of the unreality, the savage, blind, ghastly, bloody unreality that motivates a collectivized soul. The unanswered and unanswerable question in all of their desirable goals is, to whom? Desires and goals presuppose beneficiaries. Is science desirable? To whom? Not to the Soviet serfs who die of epidemics, filth, starvation, terror, and firing squads, while some bright young men wave to them from space capsules circling over their human pigsties. And not to the American father who died of heart failure brought on by overwork, struggling to send his son through college, or to the boy who could not afford college, or to the couple killed in an automobile wreck because they could not afford a new car, or to the mother who lost her child because she could not afford to send him to the best hospital. Not to any one of those people whose taxes pay for the support of our subsidized science and public research projects. Science is of value only because it expands, enriches, and protects man's life. It is not a value outside that context. Nothing is a value outside that context. And man's life means the single, specific, irreplaceable lives of individual men. The discovery of new knowledge is of value to men only when and if they are free to use and enjoy the benefits of the previously known. New discoveries are a potential value to all men, but not at the price of sacrificing all of their actual values. A progress extended into infinity, which brings no benefit to anyone, is a monstrous absurdity, and so is the conquest of space by some men, when and if it is accomplished by expropriating the labor of other men, who are left without means to acquire a pair of shoes. Progress can only come out of men's surplus, that is, from the work of those men whose ability produces more than their personal consumption requires, those who are intellectually and financially able to venture out in pursuit of the new. Capitalism is the only system where such men are free to function, and where progress is accompanied not by forced privations, but by a constant rise in the general level of prosperity, of consumption, and of enjoyment of life. It is only to the frozen unreality inside a collectivized brain that human lives are interchangeable, and only such a brain can contemplate as moral or desirable the sacrifice of generations of living men for the alleged benefits which public science or public industry or public concerts will bring to the unborn. Soviet Russia is the clearest, but not the only illustration of the achievements of collectivized mentalities. 2 generations of Russians have lived, toiled, and died in misery, waiting for the abundance promised by the rulers, who pleaded for patience and commanded austerity, while building public industrialization and killing public hope in 5-year installments. At first, The people starved while waiting for electric generators and tractors. They are still starving while waiting for atomic energy and interplanetary travel. That waiting has no end. The unborn profiteers of that wholesale sacrificial slaughter will never be born. The sacrificial animals will merely breed new hordes of sacrificial animals, as the history of all the tyrannies has demonstrated, while the unfocused eyes of a collectivized brain will stare on, undeterred, and speak of a vision of service to mankind, mixing interchangeably the corpses of the present with the ghosts of the future, but seeing no men. Such is the status of reality in the soul of the milquetoast, who looks with envy at the achievements of industrialists, and dreams of what beautiful public parks he could create if only everyone's lives, efforts, and resources were turned over to him. Sound a little bit like Klaus Schwab, The Great Reset, anyone? All public projects are mausoleums, not always in shape, but always in cost. The next time you encounter one of these public-spirited dreamers who tells you rancorously that some very desirable goals cannot be achieved without everybody's participation, tell him that if he cannot obtain everybody's voluntary participation, his goals had jolly well better remain unachieved, and that men's lives are not his to dispose of. And if you wish, give him the following example of the ideals he advocates. It is medically possible to take the corneas of a man's eyes immediately after his death and transplant them to the eyes of a living man who is blind, thus restoring his sight, in certain types of blindness. Now, according to collectivized ethics, this poses a social problem. Should we wait until a man's death to cut out his eyes when other men need them? Should we regard everybody's eyes as public property and devise a fair method of distribution? Would you advocate cutting out a living man's eye and giving it to a blind man so as to equalize them? No? Then don't struggle any further with questions about public projects in a free society. You know the answer. The principle is the same. That penned in January 1963 by Ayn Rand, and I think you can pretty well see how that is playing out here today, some 50, 60 years later. Chapter 11, The Monument Builders, another one by Ayn Rand in this collection of essays. Says, what had once been an alleged ideal is now a ragged skeleton rattling like a scarecrow in the wind over the whole world. But men lack the courage to glance up and to discover the grinning skull under the bloody rags. That skeleton is socialism. 50 years ago, there might have been some excuse, though not justification, for the widespread belief that socialism is a political theory motivated by benevolence and aimed at the achievement of men's well-being. Today, that belief can no longer be regarded as an innocent error. Socialism has been tried on every continent of the globe. In light of its results, it is time to question the motives of socialism's advocates. The essential characteristics of socialism is the denial of individual property rights. Let me repeat that. The essential characteristic of socialism is the denial of individual property, or could be said land, rights. Under socialism, the right to property, which is the right of use and disposal, is vested in society as a whole. In effect, in the collective, with production and distribution controlled by the state, in effect, by the government. Socialism may be established by force, as in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or by vote, as in Nazi National Socialist Germany. The degree of socialization may be total, as in Russia, or partial, as in England. Theoretically, the differences are superficial. Practically, they are only a matter of time. The basic principle, in all cases, is the same. The alleged goals of socialism were the abolition of poverty, the achievement of general prosperity, progress, peace, and human brotherhood. The results have been a terrifying failure. Terrifying. That is, if one's motive is men's welfare. Instead of prosperity, socialism has brought economic paralysis and or collapse to every country that tried it. The degree of socialization has been the degree of disaster. The consequences have varied accordingly. England, once the freest and proudest nation of Europe, has been reduced to the status of a second-rate power and is perishing slowly from hemophilia, losing the best of her economic blood, the middle class, and the professions. The able, competent, productive, independent men are leaving by the thousands, migrating to Canada or the United States in search of freedom. They are escaping from the reign of mediocrity, from the mawkish poorhouse where, having sold their rights in exchange for free dentures, the inmates are now whining that they'd rather be red than dead. In more fully socialized countries, famine was the start, the insignia announcing socialist rule, as in Soviet Russia, as in Red China, as in Cuba. In those countries, socialism reduced the people to the unspeakable poverty of the pre-industrial ages, to literal starvation, and has kept them on a stagnant level of misery. No, it is not just temporary, as socialism's apologists have been saying for half a century. After 45 years of government planning, Russia is still unable to solve the problem of feeding her population. As far as superior productivity and speed of economic progress are concerned, the question of any comparisons between capitalism and socialism has been answered once and for all, for any honest person, by the present difference between West and East Berlin. Instead of peace, socialism has introduced a new kind of gruesome lunacy into international relations, the Cold War, which is a state of chronic war with undeclared periods of peace between wantonly sudden invasions, with Russia seizing one-third of the globe, with socialist tribes and nations at one another's throats, with socialist India invading Goa, and communist China invading socialist India. An eloquent sign of the moral corruption of our age is the callous complacency with which most of the socialists and their sympathizers, the liberals, regard the atrocities perpetrated in socialistic countries and accept rule by terror as a way of life, while posturing as advocates of human brotherhood. In the 1930s, they did protest against the atrocities of Nazi Germany, but apparently it was not an issue of principle, but only the protest of a rival gang fighting for the same territory, because we do not hear their voices any longer. In the name of humanity, they condone and accept the following: the abolition of all freedom and all rights, the expropriation of all property, executions without trial, torture chambers, slave labor camps, the mass slaughter of countless millions in Soviet Russia, and the bloody horror of East Berlin, including the bullet-riddled bodies of fleeing children. When one observes the nightmare of the desperate efforts made by hundreds of thousands of people struggling to escape from the socialized countries of Europe, to escape over barbed wire fences under machine gun fire, one can no longer believe that socialism, in any of its forms, is motivated by benevolence and by the desire to achieve men's welfare. No man of authentic benevolence could evade or ignore so great a horror on so vast a scale. Socialism is not a movement of the people. It is a movement of the intellectuals, originated, led, and controlled by the intellectuals, carried by them out of their stuffy ivory towers into those bloody fields of practice where they unite with their allies and executors, the thugs. What, then, is the motive of such intellectuals? Power lust. Power lust as a manifestation of helplessness, of self-loathing, and of the desire for the unearned. The desire for the unearned has two aspects: the unearned in matter and the unearned in spirit, and by spirit I mean man's consciousness. These two aspects are necessarily interrelated. but a man's desire may be focused predominantly on one or the other. The desire for the unearned in spirit is the more destructive of the two, and the more corrupt. It is a desire for unearned greatness. It is expressed, but not defined, by the foggy murk of the term prestige. The seekers of unearned material benefits are merely financial parasites, moochers, looters, or criminals, who are too limited in number and in mind to be a threat to civilization, until and unless they are released and legalized by the seekers of unearned greatness. Unearned greatness is so unreal, so neurotic a concept, that the wretch who seeks it cannot identify it even to himself. To identify it is to make it impossible. He needs the irrational, undefinable slogans of altruism and collectivism to give a semi-plausible form to his nameless urge and anchor it to reality, to support his own self-deception more than to deceive his victims. The public interest, service to the public, are the means, the tools, the swinging pendulums of the power-luster's self-hypnosis. Since there is no such entity as the public, since the public is merely a number of individuals, any claimed or implied conflict of the public interest with private interest means that the interests of some men are to be sacrificed to the interests and wishes of others. Since the concept is so conveniently undefinable, its use rests only on any given gang's ability to proclaim that the public c'est moi, and to maintain the claim at the point of a gun. No such claim has ever been or can ever be maintained without the help of a gun. That is, without physical force. But, on the other hand, without that claim, gunmen would remain where they belong, in the underworld, and would not rise to the councils of state to rule the destinies of nations. There are two ways of claiming that the public, c'est moi. One is practiced by the crude material parasite who clamors for government handouts in the name of a public need and pockets what he has not earned. The other is practiced by his leader, the spiritual parasite, who derives his illusion of greatness, like a fence receiving stolen goods, from the power to dispose of that which he has not earned, and from the mystic view of himself as the embodied voice of the public. Of the two, the material parasite is psychologically healthier and closer to reality. At least, he eats or wears his loot. But the only source of satisfaction open to the spiritual parasite, his only means to gain prestige, apart from giving orders and spreading terror, is the most wasteful, useless, and meaningless activity of all, the building of public monuments. Greatness is achieved by the productive effort of a man's mind in the pursuit of clearly defined rational goals. But a delusion of grandeur can be served only by the switching, undefinable chimera of a public monument, which is presented as a munificent gift to the victims whose forced labor or extorted money had paid for it, which is dedicated to the service of all and none, owned by all and none, gaped at by all and enjoyed by none. This is the ruler's only way to appease his obsession, prestige. Prestige? In whose eyes? In anyone's? In the eyes of his tortured victims, of the beggars in the streets of his kingdom, of the bootlickers at his court, of the foreign tribes and the rulers beyond the borders? It is to impress all those eyes, the eyes of everyone and no one, that the blood of generations of subjects have been spilled and spent. Now one may see in certain biblical movies a graphic image of the meaning of public monument building, the building of the pyramids, hordes of starved, ragged, emaciated men straining the last effort of their inadequate muscles at the inhuman task of pulling the ropes that drag large chunks of stone, straining like tortured beasts of burden under the whips of overseers, collapsing on the job, and dying in the desert sands, that a dead pharaoh might lie in an imposingly senseless structure, and thus gain eternal prestige in the eyes of the unborn of future generations. Temples and palaces are the only monuments left of mankind's early civilizations. They were created by the same means and at the same price. A price not justified by the fact that primitive people undoubtedly believed, while dying of starvation and exhaustion, that the prestige of their tribe, the rulers or their gods, was of value to them somehow. Some fell, bankrupted by statist controls and taxation, while its emperors were building colosseums. Louis XIV of France taxed his people into a state of indigence, while he built the Palace of Versailles for his contemporary monarchs to envy and for modern tourists to visit. The marble-lined Moscow subway, built by the unpaid volunteer labor of Russian workers, including women, is a public monument, and so is the czarist-like luxury of the champagne and caviar receptions at the Soviet embassies, which is needed, while the people stand in line for inadequate food rations to maintain the prestige of the Soviet Union. The great distinction of the United States of America, up to the last few decades, was the modesty of its public monuments. Such monuments as did exist were genuine. They were not erected for prestige, but were functional structures that had housed events of great historical importance. If you have seen the austere simplicity of Independence Hall, you have seen the difference between authentic grandeur and the pyramids of public-spirited prestige seekers. In America, human effort and material resources were not expropriated for public monuments and public projects, but were spent on the progress of the private, personal, individual well-being of individual citizens. America's greatness lies in the fact that her actual monuments are not public. The skyline of New York is a monument of a splendor that no pyramids or palaces will ever equal or approach. But America's skyscrapers were not built by public funds, nor for a public purpose. They were built by the energy, initiative, and wealth of private individuals for personal profit. And, instead of impoverishing the people, these skyscrapers, as they rose higher and higher, kept raising the people's standard of living, including the inhabitants of the slums, who led a life of luxury compared to the life of an ancient Egyptian slave, or of a modern Soviet socialist worker. Such is the difference, both in theory and practice, between capitalism and socialism. It is impossible to compute the human suffering, degradation, deprivation, and horror that went to pay for a single, much-touted skyscraper of Moscow, or for the Soviet factories or mines or dams, or for any part of their loot and blood-supported industrialization. What we do know, however, is that the 45 years is a long time. It is a span of 2 generations. We do know that, in the name of a promised abundance, 2 generations of human beings have lived and died in subhuman poverty. And we do know that today's advocates of socialism are not deterred by a fact of this kind. Whatever motive they might assert, benevolence is one they have long since lost the right to claim. The ideology of socialization, in a neo-fascist form, is now floating, by default, through the vacuum of our intellectual and cultural atmosphere. Observe how often we are asked for undefined sacrifices to unspecified purposes. Observe how often the present administration is invoking the public interest. Observe what prominence the issue of international prestige has suddenly acquired, and what grotesquely suicidal policies are justified by references to matters of prestige. Observe that during the recent Cuban crisis, when the factual issue concerned nuclear missiles and nuclear war, our diplomats and commentators found it proper seriously to weigh such things as the prestige, the personal feelings, and the face-saving of the sundry socialist rulers involved. There is no difference between the principles, policies, and practical results of socialism and those of any historical or prehistorical tyranny. Socialism is merely democratic absolute monarchy, that is, a system of absolutism without a fixed head, open to seizure of power by all comers, by any ruthless climber, opportunist, adventurer, demagogue, or thug. When you consider socialism, do not fool yourself about its nature. Remember that there is no such dichotomy as human rights versus property rights. No human rights can exist without property rights. Since material goods are produced by the mind and effort of individual men and are needed to sustain their lives, if the producer does not own the result of his effort, he does not own his life. To deny property rights means to turn men into property owned by the state. Whoever claims the right to redistribute the wealth produced by others is claiming the right to treat human beings as chattel. When you consider the global devastation perpetrated by socialism, the sea of blood, and the millions of victims, remember that they were sacrificed not for the good of mankind, nor for any noble ideal, but for the festering vanity of some scared brute or some pretentious mediocrity who craved a mantle of unearned greatness. And that the monument to socialism is a pyramid of public factories, public theaters, and public parks, erected on a foundation of human corpses, with the figure of the ruler posturing on top, beating his chest and screaming his plea for prestige to the starless void above him. That penned in December 1962, and again, yet another chapter here I think we can see fairly well playing out right before our eyes. And don't accept the fact that they say, oh, it's different this time. It's never different. It always ends the same. Misery. Chapter 12. Men's Rights. If one wishes to advocate a free society, that is, capitalism, one must realize that its indispensable foundation is the principle of individual rights. If one wishes to uphold individual rights, one must realize that capitalism is the only system that can uphold and protect them. And if one wishes to gauge a relationship of freedom to the goals of today's intellectuals, one may gauge it by the fact that the concept of individual rights is evaded, distorted, perverted, and seldom discussed, most conspicuously seldom by the so-called conservatives. Rights are a moral concept, the concept that provides a logical transition from the principles guiding an individual's actions to the principles guiding his relationship with others, the concept that preserves and protects individual morality in a social context, the link between the moral code of a man and the legal code of a society, between ethics and politics. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. Every political system is based on some code of ethics. The dominant ethics of mankind's history were variants of the altruist collectivist doctrine, which subordinated the individual to some higher authority, either mystical or social. Consequently, most political systems were variants of the same statist tyranny, differing only in degree, not in basic principle, limited only by the accidents of tradition, of chaos, of bloody strife, and periodic collapse. Under all such systems, morality was a code applicable to the individual, but not to society. Society was placed outside the moral law, as its embodiment, or source, or exclusive interpreter, and the inculcation of self-sacrificial devotion to social duty was regarded as the main purpose of ethics in man's earthly existence. Since there is no such entity as society, since society is only a number of individual men, this meant, in practice, that the rulers of society were exempt from moral law, subject only to traditional rituals. They held total power and exacted blind obedience on the implicit principle of the good is that which is good for society, or for the tribe, the race, the nation, and the ruler's edicts are its voice on earth. This was true of all status systems, under all variants of the altruist collectivist ethic, mystical or social. The divine right of kings summarizes a political theory of the first, vox populi, vox Dei, of the second. As witness, the theocracy of Egypt with the pharaoh as an embodied god, the unlimited majority rule of democracy or democracy of Athens, the welfare state run by the emperors of Rome, the Inquisition of the late Middle Ages, the absolute monarchy of France, the welfare state of Bismarck's Prussia, the gas chambers of Nazi Germany, the slaughterhouse of the Soviet Union. All these political systems were expressions of the altruist collectivist ethics, and their common characteristic is the fact that society stood above the moral law as an omnipotent, sovereign whim worshipper. Thus, politically, all these systems were variants of an amoral society. The most profoundly revolutionary achievement of the United States of America was the subordination of society to moral law. The principle of man's individual rights represented the extension of morality into the social system as a limitation on the power of the state, as man's protection against the brute force of the collective, as the subordination of might to right. The United States was the first moral society in history. All previous systems had regarded man as a sacrificial means to the ends of others, and society as an end in itself. The United States regarded man as an end in himself, and society as a means to the peaceful, orderly, voluntary coexistence of individuals. All previous systems had held that man's life belongs to society, that society can dispose of him in any way it pleases, and that any freedom he enjoys is his only by favor, by the permission of society, which may be revoked at any time. The United States held that man's life is his by right, which means by moral principle and by his nature, that a right is the property of an individual, that society, as such, has no rights, and that the only moral purpose of a government is the protection of individual rights. A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. There is only one fundamental right. All the others are its consequences or corollaries. A man's right to his own life. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. The right to life means the right to engage in self-sustaining and self-generated action, which means the freedom to take all the actions required by the nature of a rational being for the support, the furtherance, the fulfillment, and the enjoyment of his own life. Such is the meaning of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The concept of a right pertains only to action, specifically to freedom of action. It means freedom from physical compulsion, coercion, or interference by other men. Thus, for every individual, a right is the moral sanction of a positive, of his freedom to act on his own judgment, for his own goals, by his own voluntary, uncoerced choice. As to his neighbors, his rights impose no obligations on them except of a negative kind, to abstain from violating his rights. The right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man has no right to the product of his effort. No right to the product of his effort, has no means to sustain his life. There we go. The man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. Bear in mind that the right to property is a right to action. Like all the others, it is not the right to an object, but to the action and the consequences of producing or earning that object. It is not a guarantee that a man will earn any property, but only a guarantee that he will own it if he earns it. It is the right to gain, to keep, to use, and to dispose of material values. The concept of individual rights is so new in human history that most men have not grasped it fully to this day. In accordance with these two theories of ethics, the mystical or the social, some men assert that rights are a gift of God, others that rights are a gift of society. But, in fact, the source of rights is man's nature. The Declaration of Independence stated that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Whether one believes that man is a product of a creator or of nature, the issue of man's origin does not alter the fact that he is an entity of a specific kind, a rational being, that he cannot function successfully under coercion, and that rights are a necessary condition of his particular mode of survival. The source of man's rights is not divine law or congressional law, but the law of identity. A is A and man is man. Rights are conditions of existence, required by man's nature for his proper survival. If man is to live on earth, it is right for him to use his mind. It is right to act on his own free judgment. It is right to work for his values and to keep the product of his work. If life on earth is his purpose, he has a right to live as a rational being. Nature forbids him the irrational. That a quip from Atlas Shrugged. To violate man's rights means to compel him to act against his own judgment, or to expropriate his values. Basically, there is only one way to do it, by the use of physical force. There are two potential violators of man's rights, the criminals and the government. The great achievement of the United States was to draw a distinction between these two by forbidding to the second the legalized version of the activities of the first. The Declaration of Independence laid down the principle that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This provided the only valid justification of a government and defined its only proper purpose, to protect man's rights by protecting him from physical violence. Thus, the government's function was changed from the role of ruler to the role of servant. The government was set to protect man from criminals, and the Constitution was written to protect man from the government. The Bill of Rights was not directed against private citizens, but against the government, as an explicit declaration that individual rights supersede any public or social power. The result was the pattern of a civilized society, which, for the brief span of some 150 years, America came close to achieving. A civilized society is one in which physical force is banned from human relationships, in which the government, acting as a policeman, may use force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. This was the essential meaning and intent of America's political philosophy, implicit in the principle of individual rights. But it was not formulated explicitly, nor fully accepted, nor consistently practiced. America's inner contradiction was the altruist, collectivist ethics. Altruism is incompatible with freedom, with capitalism, and with individual rights. One cannot combine the pursuit of happiness with the moral status of a sacrificial animal. It was the concept of individual rights that had given birth to a free society. It was with the destruction of individual rights that the destruction of freedom had to begin. A collectivist tyranny dare not enslave a country by an outright confiscation of its values, material or moral. It has to be done by a process of internal corruption. Just as in the material realm of the plundering of a country's wealth is accomplished by inflating the currency, so today one may witness the process of inflation being applied to the realm of rights. The process entails such a growth of newly promulgated rights the people do not notice the fact that the meaning of the concept is being reversed. Just as bad money drives out good money, so these printing press rights negate authentic rights. Consider the curious fact that never has there been such a proliferation all over the world of two contradictory phenomena, of alleged new rights and of slave labor camps. The gimmick was the switch of the concept of rights from the political to the economic realm. The Dem Party platform of 1960 summarizes the switch boldly and explicitly. It declares that a democratic administration will reaffirm the Economic Bill of Rights which Franklin Roosevelt wrote into our national conscience 16 years ago. Bear clearly in mind the meaning of the concept of rights when you read the list which that platform offers. Number 1. The right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. Number 2. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Number 3. The right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. Number 4. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home and abroad. Number 5. The right of every family to a decent home. Number 6. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. Number 7. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accidents, and unemployment. Number 8. The right to a good education. A single question added to each of the above 8 clauses would make the issue clear. At whose expense? Jobs, food, clothing, recreation, homes, medical care, education, etc. do not grow in nature. These are man-made values, goods and services produced by men. Who is to provide them? If some men are entitled by rights to the products of the work of others, that means that those others are deprived of rights and condemned to slave labor. Any alleged right of one man, which necessitates the violation of rights of another, is not and cannot be a right. No man can have a right to impose an unchosen obligation, an unrewarded duty, or an involuntary servitude on another man. There can be no such thing as the right to enslave. A right does not include the material implementation of that right by other men. It includes only the freedom to earn that implementation by one's own effort. Observe in this context the intellectual precision of the Founding Fathers. They spoke of the right to the pursuit of happiness, not of the right to happiness. It means that a man has a right to take the actions he deems necessary to achieve his happiness. It does not mean that others must make him happy. The right to life means that a man has a right to support his life by his own work, on any economic level, as high as his ability will carry him. It does not mean that others must provide him with the necessities of life. The right to property means that a man has a right to take the economic actions necessary to earn property, to use it, and to dispose of it. It does not mean that others must provide him with property. The right of free speech means that a man has the right to express his ideas without danger of suppression, interference, punitive action by the government. It does not mean that others must provide him with a lecture hall, a radio station, or a printing press through which to express his ideas. Any undertaking that involves more than one man requires the voluntary consent of every participant. Every one of them has the right to make his own decision, but none has a right to force his decision on the others. There is no such thing as a right to a job. There is only the right of free trade. That is, a man's right to take a job if another man chooses to hire him. There is no right to a home, only the right of free trade, the right to build a home or to buy it. There are no rights to a fair wage or a fair price, if no one chooses to pay it, to hire a man, or to buy his product. There are no rights of consumers to milk, shoes, movies, or champagne if no producers choose to manufacture such items. There is only the right to manufacture them oneself. There are no rights of special groups. There are no rights of farmers, of workers, of businessmen, of employees, or of employers, of the old, of the young, of the unborn. There are only the rights of man, rights possessed by every individual man and by all men as individuals. Property rights and the right of free trade are man's only economic rights. They are, in fact, political rights. And there can be no such thing as an economic Bill of Rights. But observe that the advocates of the latter have all but destroyed the former. Remember that rights are moral principles which define and protect a man's freedom of action, but impose no obligations on other men. Private citizens are not a threat to one another's rights or freedom. A private citizen who resorts to physical force and violates the rights of others is a criminal, and men have legal protections against him. Criminals are a small minority in any age or country, and the harm they have done to mankind is infinitesimal when compared to the horrors, the bloodshed, the wars, the persecutions, the confiscations, the famines, the enslavements, the wholesale destructions perpetrated by mankind's governments. Potentially, a government is the most dangerous threat to man's rights. It holds a legal monopoly on the use of physical force against legally disarmed victims. When unlimited and unrestricted by individual rights, a government is men's deadliest enemy. It is not as protection against private actions, but against governmental actions that the Bill of Rights was written. Now, observe the process by which that protection is being destroyed. The process consists of ascribing to private citizens the specific violations constitutionally forbidden to the government, which private citizens have no power to commit, and thus freeing the government from all restrictions. The switch is becoming progressively more obvious in the field of free speech. For years, the collectivists have been propagating the notion that a private individual's refusal to finance an opponent is a violation of the opponent's right of free speech and an act of censorship. It is censorship, they claim, if a newspaper refuses to employ or publish writers whose ideas are diametrically opposed to its policy. It is censorship, they claim, if businessmen refuse to advertise in a magazine that denounces, insults, and smears them. It is censorship, they claim, if a TV sponsor objects to some outrage perpetrated on a program he is financing, such as the incident of Alger Hiss being invited to denounce former Vice President Nixon. And then there is Newton in Minow, who declares there is censorship by ratings, by advertisers, by networks, by affiliates which reject programming offered to their areas. It is the same Mr. Minow who threatens to revoke the license of any station that does not comply with his views on programming, and who claims that that is not censorship. Consider the implications of such a trend. Censorship is a term pertaining only to governmental action. No private action is censorship. No private individual or agency can silence a man or suppress a publication. Only the government can do so. The freedom of speech of private individuals includes the right not to agree, not to listen, and not to finance one's own antagonists. But according to such doctrines as the Economic Bill of Rights, an individual has no right to dispose of his own material means by the guidance of his own convictions, and must hand over his money indiscriminately to any speakers or propagandists who have a right to his property. This means that the ability to provide the material tools for the expression of ideas deprives a man of the right to hold any ideas. It means that a publisher has to publish books he considers worthless, false, or evil. That a TV sponsor has to finance commentators who choose to affront his convictions. That the owner of a newspaper must turn his editorial pages over to any younger hooligan who clamors for the enslavement of the press. It means that one group of men acquires the right to unlimited license, while another group is reduced to helpless irresponsibility. But since it is obviously impossible to provide every claimant with a job, a microphone, or a newspaper column, who will determine the distribution of economic rights and select the recipients when the owner's right to choose has been abolished? Well, Mr. Maunow has indicated that quite clearly. And if you make the mistake of thinking that this applies only to big property owners, you had better realize that the theory of economic rights includes the right of every would-be playwright, every beatnik poet, every noise composer, and every non-objective artist who have political pull to the financial support you did not give them when you did not attend their shows. What else is the meaning of the project to spend your tax money on subsidized art? And while people are clamoring about economic rights, the concept of political rights is vanishing. It is forgotten that the right of free speech means the freedom to advocate one's views and to bear the possible consequences, including disagreement with others, opposition, unpopularity, and lack of support. The political function of the right of free speech is to protect dissenters and unpopular minorities from forcible suppression, not to guarantee them the support, advantages, and rewards of a popularity they have not gained. The Bill of Rights reads, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." It does not demand that private citizens provide a microphone for the man who advocates their destruction, or a passkey for the burglar who seeks to rob them, or a knife for the murderer who wants to cut their throats. Such is the state of one of today's most crucial issues: political rights versus economic rights. It's either or. One destroys the other. But there are, in fact, no economic rights, no collective rights, no public interest rights. The term individual rights is a redundancy. There is no other kind of rights, and no one else to possess them. Those who advocate laissez-faire capitalism are the only advocates of man's rights. That from April 1963. And of course, mind you, talking about the press back then, much slightly different than what we have today. Obviously, pre-internet era. Obviously, if this were to be rewritten in today's terms, we'd probably include the likes of our favorite social media companies, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, and the like, and how they have chosen sides, right? Because they represent the collective, right? But that doesn't exist. And it's precisely the point why, if you go back to the very beginning of the show here, why I kicked the PSA out there and talked about corporations, dead entities, don't have rights. It's man-made. Whereas, just like what Ayn Rand was talking about here, whether mystic or by the hand of God, we believe that our rights are inherent. We're born with them. You can't take them away. They're not for sale. They're not something that government can readily take from us. Period. Chapter 13. Collectivized Rights. Rights are a moral principle defining proper social relationships, just as a man needs a moral code in order to survive, in order to act, to choose the right goals and to achieve them. So a society, a group of men, needs moral principles in order to organize a social system consonant with man's nature and with the requirements of his survival. Just as a man can evade reality and act on the blind whim of any given moment, but can achieve nothing save progressive self-destruction, so a society can evade reality and establish a system ruled by the blind whims of its members or its leader, by the majority gang of any given moment, by the current demagogue, or by a permanent dictator. But such a society can achieve nothing save the rule of brute force and a state of progressive self-destruction. What subjectivism is in the realm of ethics, collectivism is in the realm of politics. Just as the notion that anything I do is right because I chose to do it, is not a moral principle, but a negation of morality. So the notion that anything society does is right because society chose to do it is not a moral principle, but a negation of moral principle and the banishment of morality from social issues. When might is opposed to right, the concept of might can have only one meaning: the power of brute physical force, which, in fact, is not a power, but the most hopeless state of impotence. It is merely the power to destroy. It is the power of a stampede of animals running amok. Yet that is the goal of most of society of today's intellectuals. At the root of all their conceptual switches there lies another, more fundamental one: the switch of the concept of rights from the individual to the collective, which means the replacement of the rights of man by the rights of mob. Since only an individual man can possess rights, the expression individual rights is a redundancy, which one has to use for purposes of clarification in today's intellectual chaos. But the expression collective rights is a contradiction in terms. Any group or collective, large or small, is only a number of individuals. A group can have no rights other than the rights of its individual members. In a free society, the rights of any group are derived from the rights of its members through the voluntary individual choice and contractual agreement, and are merely the application of these individual rights to a specific undertaking. Every legitimate group undertaking is based on the participants' right of free association and free trade. By legitimate, I mean non-criminal and freely formed, that is, a group by which no one was forced to join. For instance, the right of an industrial concern to engage in business is derived from the right of its owners to invest their money in a productive venture, from their right to hire employees, from the right of the employees to sell their services, from the right of all those involved to produce and to sell their products, from the right of the customers to buy or not to buy those products. Every link of this complex chain of contractual relationships rests on individual rights, individual choices, individual agreements. Every agreement is delimited, specified, and subject to certain conditions, that is, dependent upon a mutual trade to mutual benefit. That is true of all legitimate groups or associations in a free society: partnerships, business concerns, professional associations, labor unions, voluntary ones, political parties, etc. It applies also to all agency agreements. The right of one man to act for or represent another or others is derived from the rights of those he represents and is delegated to him by their voluntary choice for a specific, delimited purpose, as in the case of a lawyer, a business representative, a labor union delegate, etc. A group as such has no rights. A man can neither acquire new rights by joining a group nor lose the rights which he does possess. The principle of individual rights is the only moral base of all groups or associations. Any group that does not recognize this principle is not an association, but a gang or a mob. Any doctrine of group activities that does not recognize individual rights is a doctrine of mob rule or legalized lynching. The notion of collective rights the notion that rights belong to groups, not to individuals, means that rights belong to some men, but not to others, that some men have the right to dispose of others in any manner they please, and that the criterion of such privileged position consists of numerical superiority. Nothing can ever justify or validate such a doctrine, and no one ever has. Like the altruist morality from which it is derived, this doctrine rests on mysticism, either on the old-fashioned mysticism of faith and supernatural edicts like the divine right of kings, or on the social mystique of modern collectivists who see society as a superorganism, as some supernatural entity, apart from and superior to the sum of its individual members. The amorality of that collectivist mystique is particularly obvious today in the issue of national rights. A nation, like any other group, is only a number of individuals and can have no rights other than the rights of its individual citizens. A free nation, a nation that recognizes, respects, and protects the individual rights of its citizens, has a right to its territorial integrity, its social system, and its form of government. The government of such a nation is not the ruler, but the servant or agent of its citizens, and has no rights other than the rights delegated to it by the citizens for a specific, delimited task, the task of protecting them from physical force, derived from the right of self-defense. The citizens of a free nation may disagree about the specific legal procedures or methods of implementing their rights, which is a complex problem, the province of political science and of philosophy of law. But they agree on the basic principle to be implemented, the principle of individual rights. When a country's constitution places individual rights outside the reach of public authorities, the sphere of political power is severely delimited, and thus the citizens may, safely and properly, agree to abide by the decisions of a majority vote in the delimited sphere. The lives and property of minorities or dissenters are not at stake, are not subject to vote, and are not endangered by any majority decision. No man or group holds a blank check on power over others. Such a nation has a right to its sovereignty, derived from the rights of its citizens, and a right to demand that its sovereignty be respected by all other nations. But this right cannot be claimed by dictatorships, by savage tribes, or by any form of absolutist tyranny. A nation that violates the rights of its own citizens cannot claim any rights whatsoever. In the issue of rights, as in all moral issues, there can be no double standard. A nation ruled by brute physical force is not a nation, but a horde. Whether it is led by Attila, Genghis Khan, Hitler, Khrushchev, or Castro. What rights could Attila claim, and on what grounds? This applies to all forms of tribal savagery, ancient or modern, primitive or industrialized. Neither geography, nor race, nor tradition, nor previous state of development can confer on some human beings the right to violate the rights of others. The right of the self-determination of nations applies only to free societies or to societies seeking to establish freedom. It does not apply to dictatorships. Just as an individual's right of free action does not include the right to commit crimes, that is, to violate the rights of others, so the right of a nation to determine its own form of government does not include the right to establish a slave society, that is, to legalize the enslavement of some men by others. There is no such thing as a right to enslave. A nation can do it, just as a man can become a criminal, but neither can do it by right. It does not matter, in this context, whether a nation was enslaved by force, like Soviet Russia, or by vote, like Nazi Germany. Individual rights are not subject to a public vote. A supermajority or a majority has no right to vote away the rights of a minority. The political function of rights is precisely to protect minorities from oppression by majorities, and the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Whether a slave society was conquered or chose to be enslaved, it can claim no national rights and no recognition of such rights by civilized countries. Just as a mob of gangsters cannot demand a recognition of its rights and a legal equality with an industrial concern or a university on the ground that the gangsters chose by unanimous vote to engage in that particular kind of group activity. Dictatorship nations are outlaws. Any free nation had the right to invade Nazi Germany and today has the right to invade Soviet Russia, Cuba, or any other slave pen. Whether a free nation chooses to do so is not a matter of its own self-interest, not of respect for the non-existent rights of gang rulers. It is not a free nation's duty to liberate other nations at the price of self-sacrifice. But a free nation has the right to do it when and if it so chooses. This right, however, is conditional, just as the suppression of crimes does not give a policeman the right to engage in criminal activities. So the invasion and destruction of a dictatorship does not give the invader the right to establish another variant of a slave society in the conquered country. A slave country has no national rights, but the individual rights of its citizens remain valid, even if unrecognized, and the conqueror has no right to violate them. Therefore, the invasion of an enslaved country is morally justified only when and if the conquerors establish a free social system, that is, a system based on the recognition of individual rights. Since there is no fully free country today, since the so-called free world consists of various mixed economies, it might be asked whether every country on earth is morally open to invasion by every other. The answer is no. There is a difference between a country that recognizes the principle of individual rights but does not implement it fully in practice, and a country that denies and flouts it explicitly. All mixed economies are in a precarious state of transition which, ultimately, has to turn to freedom or collapse into dictatorship. There are 4 characteristics which brand a country unmistakably as a dictatorship: one-party rule, executions without trial or with a mock trial for political offenses, the nationalization or expropriation of private property, and censorship. A country guilty of these outrages forfeits any moral prerogatives, any claim to national rights or sovereignty, and becomes an outlaw. Observe on this particular issue the shameful end of trail and the intellectual disintegration of modern liberals. Internationalism had always been one of the liberals' basic tenets. They regarded nationalism as a major social evil, as a product of capitalism, and as the cause of wars. They opposed any form of national self-interest. They refused to differentiate between rational patriotism and blind racist chauvinism, denouncing both as fascist. They advocated the dissolution of national boundaries and the merging of all nations into one world. Next to property rights, national rights were the special target of their attacks. Today, it is national rights that they invoke as their last feeble, fading hold on some sort of moral justification for the results of their theories, for the brood of little statist dictatorships spreading, like a skin disease, over the surface of the globe, in the form of so-called newly emerging nations, semi-socialist, semi-communist, semi-fascist, and wholly committed only to the use of brute force. It is the national right of such countries to choose their own form of government, any form they please, that the liberals offer as a moral validation and ask us to respect. It is the national right of Cuba to its form of government. They claim that we must not violate or interfere with. Having all but destroyed the legitimate national rights of free countries, it is for dictatorships that the liberals now claim the sanction of national rights. And worse, it is not mere nationalism that the liberals champion, but racism, primordial, tribal racism. Observe the double standard. While in the civilized countries of the West, the liberals are still advocating internationalism and global self-sacrifice. The savage tribes of Asia and Africa are granted the sovereign right to slaughter one another in racial warfare. Mankind is reverting to a pre-industrial, prehistorical view of society, to racial collectivism. Such is the logical result and climax of the liberals' moral collapse, which began when, as a prelude to the collectivization of property, they accepted the collectivization of rights. Their own confession of guilt lies in their terminology. Why do they use the word rights to denote the things they are advocating? Why don't they preach what they practice? Why don't they name it openly and attempt to justify it if they can? The answer is obvious. That from June 1963. So I think that might be a good place to stop. We'll pick up on chapter 14 next. Looks like we got about, maybe about 30-some pages left here, I suppose, to round this out. So, what do you think? Doesn't it seem to be a lot of foreshadowing of what we're seeing play out here today? Again, this being written some 50, 60 years ago now. I find it rather interesting that all these things are coming to pass with the old flower power generation and the offspring of their kind. We're seeing the woke corporations, the socialists in charge, the various shenanigans on the streets. And it's always about the collective, right? Always about the collective. And now we must unify as one, right? Oh no. No. Not gonna happen. Our ideals do not mix with yours. We're not going to bow to tyranny. And we're certainly not going to give up land rights. Which, by the way, if there's any one thing I might throw out there, is do your research on the Constitution about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You can go back to a lot of original state constitutions and see clearly in your original one that these states were brought into the Union with that it was life, liberty, and land. And they made a very good attempt, even back then, to try and hide that from us. And for why? Does it make sense, pursuit of happiness versus rights to land? Land makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? So that's what I'll depart with here this evening. As always, appreciate you guys tuning in. And we'll pick this up again here real soon. We'll probably get back to some news stuff here. I'm starting to get some stuff piled up in the background. But otherwise, we'll see you back on the next one. As always, take care. God bless everybody. We'll see you back